The generation is 20. Mega Rayquaza has fallen from the AG tier to the UU tier. Chansey and Blissey got nerfed again and no longer have access to Soft Boil. Golden Go has fallen to the ZU tier, and Quagsire has ascended to the AG tier, now having access to Wonder Guard and huge power, ruling over every single tier with an iron fist. And Verlisify has wrongly accused Wolfie for cheating for like the 20th time, for literally no reason. That guy is kind of weird. Anyways, power creep. Us competitive Pokemon fans love to talk about power creep, or more accurately, complain about it. But we don't actually elaborate much on why power creep is bad. Often it seems like players complain more from an emotional point, because seeing a fan favorite Pokemon you have been using consistently for years fall because some other Pokemon came in and did its job better sucks. I know it does, especially when you aren't attached to this new Pokemon. Like, I don't want Great Tusk, I want Garchomp. But this is competitive Pokemon. There's no room for favorites or feelings or emotional attachment. What is this, a Pokemon contest? No, this is about pure facts, and the Pokemon that are good are good. However, when Tyranitar fell from OU to UU, it really hurt my feelings. So today, we'll be looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly of power creep, and we'll be doing it objectively. At least that's the goal. Number 1, the cascading effect on the lower tiers. When a Pokemon is outclassed, naturally, it finds its way into the lower tiers. This doesn't seem unhealthy yet anyway, at first. It's too weak for the higher tiers, so if it fits in the lower ones, everyone wins. Well, not exactly. Power creep affects the lower tiers much more directly than the higher ones, because of the effects we just covered. That means, for example, when Garchomp fell from OU to UU this generation, Pokemon like Hippowdon, Crocodile, and Swampert, who were all UU last gen, fell from there to RU or even NU tiers because Garchomp basically took their place. Among other reasons, it wasn't just Garchomp's fault, there were other Pokemon who were a menace to these ones. But Garchomp did outclass lots of other Pokemon trying to take the role of a ground type on a team, since usually you don't want too many Pokemon of the same type of your team. Who are you going to choose? Garchomp or Crocodile? Garchomp, you're going to choose Garchomp essentially. Think of it as an invasive species coming into a new environment and throwing off the ecosystem. Those changes aren't always positive, but even if then, one might say it's not necessarily negative. If a few ground types suffer because a better one came around, why is that bad? Now the player gets to use Garchomp in the UU tier, and they don't have to settle for another ground type that doesn't do its job better, isn't as offensively menacing, isn't as good as defensively, or doesn't have the same type of moves that Garchomp has. Well, those past UU Pokemon that fell from the old UU home then go down to the other tiers and cause havoc there, essentially doing to those tiers what Garchomp and the other OU Titans, or fallen OU Titans, did to the UU tier. Again, causing havoc and damaging the ecosystem of the RU, NU, PU tiers. That eventually means more and more Pokemon will end up in the ZU tier, which isn't a playable tier. The ZU tier is not a place you want a Pokemon to end up. And it's not just because it's a low tier. Unlike the Pokemon that have fallen to the UU and RU tiers, who can still see use, even if they aren't ranked OU, Pokemon in ZU don't really have anywhere to go, because ZU isn't actually an official tier. That means more Pokemon will eventually be forgotten. While you can use ZU Pokemon in the higher tiers, no one is going to. The ZU tier is just a place where Pokemon that never get play go. Some people tend to forget that one of the things Singles has over VGC is that supposedly every Pokemon can be used. Once a regulation is over in VGC, it's over. And if a Pokemon isn't good in VGC, it's not good, period. Singles is supposed to be a competitive format where every single Pokemon can shine, but because so many Pokemon are being power crept too rapidly, they'll never actually have time to shine. That's the whole point of Singles. For older Pokemon that have been around for a while, it's not that bad, because see, since you can go back and play those older gens where they were at least partly viable. For example, what I'm talking about is, let's take Tauros, a ZU Pokemon. Even by ZU standards, he is not a good Pokemon. No one is even using him there because there are far better wall breakers. However, you can go back and play Gen 1 OU if you want, where he is literally the best Pokemon in the game. he is on every single team. So if you're a Tauros fan, it's fine. Maybe you're not going to use him in Gen 9 OU. Actually, you're definitely not going to use him in Gen 9 OU, but you definitely are going to use him in Gen 1 OU. Same thing for, let's say, Flygon. No one is using him on any OU or even UU team, but in Generation 3 and Generation 4, he was a great OU mon, so you can go play those tiers. So it's all good, right? Well, no, not every single Pokemon is that lucky. See, for Pokemon being introduced now that automatically end up in the ZU tier, they will literally never get a chance to be used. Why? Well, for example, let's take Calyrex. Not that one, this one. If this Pokemon had been introduced in a previous gen, he probably would have managed to get some play. But since he was introduced in Generation 9, where there's too much competition, he gets absolutely no play, just like you and me. See, Pokemon that you may want to use in Generation 9 that were introduced because you just like them, you think they're cool, you can't use. They're not viable in any tier. Competitive singles has kind of lost an aspect that made it special and different, especially from VGC, which is the official format. So it'll always have that over singles. I'm not saying that singles has to be better than VGC. VGC has things that single doesn't that I really like. That's it. There are things that make these two formats special. And I think the fact that every single Pokemon could have theoretically found a home in singles is what made the game special. It doesn't have that anymore. That's not just me talking from an emotional point. I feel like it's almost objectively a bad thing. Something that can also be seen, especially in Generation 9, is that since Game Freak desperately wants to make more impressive Pokemon each time, more impressive moves and ability, etc., they are going to reach a point where the threshold is met. Okay. And it feels like we're reaching that threshold fairly soon. What does that mean? Well, for example, let's take a look at not even the Uber tier, but just the OU tier. Look at Golden Go. He has an ability called Good as Gold. You've probably heard of it. And this Pokemon is immune to status condition and even prevents defog. These are two very important functions in the game, and he just ignores them. Golden Go, you can't just ignore defog. You're already ignoring Rapid Spin. You can't do that. That's not how you play! He breaks the rules. And even though this channel is about singles, let's take a look at VGC. I'm no VGC expert, but I have very much heard of the infamous Urshifu Rapid Strike. And that's not just because he's also viable in singles. Urshifu Rapid Strike ignores Protect, the pivotal aspect of VGC. Protect is definitely used in singles, but not as much as in VGC. In VGC, Protect is one of the most important moves in the game, and if I'm not mistaken, probably the most important moves in the game. In order to one-up themselves and make the game more interesting, Game Freak is willing to break the rules and mechanics they themselves set up, making the game more chaotic. However, there is a main argument for power creep, and one that is always brought up because it's valid. It's a good argument, which is that it's necessary to keep the game fresh and new. Power creep isn't all bad. If it were purely bad, then everything after Generation 1 that was added would have to qualify as bad for competitive play. But that's not true at all, because if that were true, Generation 1 would be the most popular way to play competitive singles. But it's not. Generation 1 was fun, but it wasn't balanced. I hope that's not too controversial to say. It's fun, but dear God, it is not balanced. The Dark and Steel types were necessary additions for a healthy metagame. They nerfed the overpowered Psychic and Normal type at the time. That resulted in, yes, power creep. Pokemon like Tauros were power crept, but it was necessary, or else the game would have gotten stale and it would never be balanced. Even if Game Freak did a better job at power scaling, which let's face it, they never will, eventually a threshold would be met. Power creep is a necessary evil in the world of Pokemon, but there are good and bad ways to actually do that. Power creep is a pretty controversial issue because, like I said, it's not something that's black and white, it's very nuanced, but when people talk about it, they mostly do it from an emotional aspect. So tell me what you think of it. There are definitely arguments that I didn't bring up on both sides, especially for why power creep is necessary. Because I feel like the fact that it's necessary is already a very good argument. We literally need it. It's a necessary evil, like I said. Kind of like hazards, or stall, or Blissey and Chansey.